Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming to tonight's Askwith Forum and to the Harvard Graduate School of Education. These Askwith Forums are an opportunity for us to bring folks together to discuss some of the high priority issues and challenges facing education, and we generally try to time them with the release of the President's budget for the year. We were quite lucky on that front, so we're quite delighted. We just spent half an hour kind of trying to go through the numbers to really see what the right number of billions of dollars is to describe what the President's budget included today for preschool education. So my name is Hiro Yoshikawa. I'm the academic dean at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I conduct research on policy in areas of early childhood education, anti-poverty policies, and immigration. So I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but we know that early childhood education can be perhaps the best investment that a government can make to ensure economic productivity, responsible citizenship, and strong communities in our nation and globally. Of course, the neuroscience data, of which there's been an explosion in the last 30 years, shows that if we miss this key period of investment in children's lives, we risk compromising fundamental brain architecture, which is being built in the early childhood years. Then the economic data, of course, show benefits for society as a whole, with long-term effects when early childhood education is done right. Long-term effects on reducing special education placements, grade retention, increasing high school graduation, and reduced crime, including work of some of the panelists here, some of our other faculty like David Deming. But, and this is a great big but that we're going to focus on today, how do we ensure that our investment actually pays off? And what is required in terms of quality to maximize and then sustain benefits into the primary years and beyond for children. How can quality be implemented at scale to reach more children and address the urgent access and equity issues that we have in early childhood investments in the US? And again, these are relevant globally, and I know we have quite a few international visitors here today as part of the ProLair meeting from Latin America, from Europe, from other places. So welcome to you all as well. So the important thing to emphasize here is that not all programs are effective in early childhood. And this is not a magic bullet that is going to solve all of our society's long-term problems in terms of human capital development, health, and behavior across the lifespan. So if not all programs are effective, what distinguishes the programs that are more effective and have larger positive effects on kids' health, learning, and behavior? Well, we know what these are. We have decades of research, much of which has been summarized by work at the Center on the Developing Child, which Jack Schoenkoff directs, and I'll introduce him and the other panelists in a minute. But here are some of the effectiveness factors that are really the keys to what quality means, because we need to get to a more specific kind of conversation than simply to say that we need high-quality programs. It means small group sizes and high adult-child ratios. It means a developmentally focused curriculum that both teachers and kids enjoy. Safe physical setting, of course, skilled and well-compensated staff, a language-rich environment, and responsiveness and warmth in the interactions, what we call serve and return interactions between children and adults. So if a child is serving a communication, whether it be by gesture or by vocalization or by emotion, there is a contingent and quick response from adults. And when I say adults, I mean not only teachers, but the ability to encourage those kinds of interactions in parents as well. So where are we in terms of current coverage in preschool education in the United States? In 2011, the percent of 4-year-olds who were attending either center-based programs or preschools, and this is across public and private providers, was 74%. Of that, 11%, so if we look at the numbers that add up to 74%, 11% of 4-year-olds were in the federal Head Start program, which is targeted to children under 130% of the federal poverty line. 28% were in public pre-kindergarten programs, most of which are also means tested at the pre-kindergarten level, but some of which stretch up into moderate income families and are open to families with higher incomes. And 35% in other centers that might cover a whole variety of other providers, private programs, special education, preschools, those kinds of things. So that's where we are as a nation. We've made a tremendous amount of progress over the last decades, but we still have quite a ways to go. And that's why President Obama proposed in his State of the Union address, he became the first president in the history of the United States to propose universal pre-kindergarten as a federal policy goal where the federal government would play an active role. And so what happened in the budget that was released this morning was quite extraordinary. Investment in preschool education and the other early childhood aspects of this budget are the single largest area of new investment in this year's federal budget. And that is a prioritization of early childhood development in a U.S. federal budget that we have not seen in, perhaps ever. It's to be paid for through tobacco tax increases, but we won't spend that much time today talking about tobacco unless you really want us to. So what are the 4 elements that he is proposing? A key one is expansion not only for low-income families, but also higher-income families. So the federal share of the budget today, which is a proposal for $75 billion over a 10-year period, would be provided for children under 200% of the federal poverty line. This really means those who are meeting the official federal poverty line, but we all know that with costs of living and the datedness of the federal poverty line, that a true indicator of kind of poverty in the United States is actually closer to something like 200% of the federal poverty line. With incentives for states to provide additional slots for children above 200% of the poverty line. And so this is kind of a new item moving towards truly universal preschool education. Once states have provided pre-kindergarten to low and moderate income 4-year-olds, and there are states vary in how far they have gotten on this front, this money can be used to expand the availability of full-day kindergarten, because in far too many places in our country we still don't have full-day kindergarten. Finally, the president, and this is all has been available since right after his State of the Union address, put a stake in the ground as far as the importance of quality. And actually, we see elements of quality, but I think the challenge will be how is this actually implemented. In terms of quality, what the president mentioned were state-level standards for early learning, data and assessment systems, well-trained teachers paid comparably to K-12 teachers, small class sizes, low adult-to-child ratios, the implementation of rigorous curricula, comprehensive health and related services, and evaluation and review of programs. So the big questions that we're going to start with in terms of posing to the panel, and then we look forward to having a Q&A session here after some panel discussion time, are these the right priorities? Is this the right vision for preschool education at this point in the United States? How can these actually be implemented? Because the budget today did not give a lot of details on what the implementation will look like. That will be hashed out in details in both the Congress and work of the White House with the Congress in coming months. And finally, if we take a more future-oriented look towards early childhood education, where should the priorities be thinking ahead, not just 10 years, but the next 10 to 20 years around reinventing the field of early childhood education? The final thing I'm going to do before introducing the speakers is to note that today we're talking primarily really about pre-kindergarten, so we won't be talking so much about kids 0 to 3. But there are elements proposed in the budget today for 0 to 3-year-olds as well. So I'm going to introduce folks in the order in which they are sitting to my left. So Stephanie Jones is the Marie and Max Kargman Associate Professor in Human Development and Urban Education Advancement here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She is an expert in the relationship between socio-emotional development and cognitive development, and how to encourage improvements in these key areas of human development from early childhood all the way up to adolescence. So she's been involved in some historic intervention and evaluation studies, such as the Chicago School Readiness Project. She has currently developed and is evaluating a major socio-emotional curriculum for the primary grades to be implemented in an integrated way with the Success for All program, which focuses on academic achievement. And she's been extensively funded by a whole variety of federal and foundation sources. She received her undergraduate degree from Barnard College at Columbia and her PhD at Yale University. Next, A.J. Chaudhry is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Services Policy at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And so he has actually been working directly with the White House and the departments of his own department, but also the Department of Education in the crafting of this preschool proposal. Prior to his appointment, he was a senior fellow and director of the Center on Labor, Human Services, and Population at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., served as the Deputy Commissioner for Child Care and Head Start for New York City, where he oversaw the city's early childhood development program, serving 150,000 children in low-income families, and was the author of Putting Children First, How Low-Wage Working Mothers Manage Child Care, which was a longitudinal ethnographic study of how families experience child care policy and programs in New York City. That book was a finalist for the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. And he got his undergraduate degree at Columbia, his master's in public policy here at the Kennedy School, as well as his doctorate here at the Kennedy School. Jacqueline Jones is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Early Learning from the U.S. Department of Education, and so now has a lot of time on her hands, has her life back. Previously served as Assistant Commissioner for the Division of Early Childhood Education for the New Jersey State Department of Education. And prior to state government, worked for 16 years at the Educational Testing Service at ETS as a senior research scientist and director of early childhood research. She has taught for us here at the School of Education. Her BA is from Hunter College and doctorate and master's degrees from Northwestern University. And finally, Jack Shonkoff, who probably needs no introduction, but he is the Julius Richmond Famry Professor of Child Health and Development at the Harvard School of Public Health, Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital, and Director of the university-wide Center on the Developing Child here at Harvard. He's Chair of the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, and in 2011, Jack launched the Frontiers of Innovation project, which is a collaboration committed to developing intervention strategies for the future. So developing innovations that can then be tested in science-based ways at scale in communities, in cities, and in states across the US. He is the primary editor of the landmark report, of course, From Neurons to Neighborhoods, that really helped spur much of the early childhood policy development in the US since the year 2000, when that landmark report was released. his undergraduate degree is from Cornell University and his medical degree from the NYU School of Medicine. So we're going to start this by each of the panelists taking about 3 minutes to respond to this question of, is this the right vision? How can it be implemented? What about thinking about the future? And we're going to go in the order of AJ, then Jacqueline, then Stephanie, and then Jack. And then we'll do a bit of kind of panel discussion, and we'll open up to Q&A.
So thank you, Hero, and I want to thank the School of Education here for inviting me to participate in this forum. And thank you, Jack.
Icebreaker.
I have a cold. I'm sorry.
All right.
Dirty trick.
On what's such an important and timely topic. The timing is actually impeccable. This is for those of us, which includes everybody sitting on this podium, who've spent the better parts of our careers thinking about early childhood care and development. This is sort of for, and those of us who've been trying to do so in government, a historic moment, really from the very outset of the president's second term in office, on the morning of his inaugural address, then again, when he addressed the country about the State of the Union. He's outlined his priorities for moving the country forward very clearly, that he sees future economic growth depends on a large and growing and thriving middle class. And at the center of that is a major priority that education investments in the country really do need to begin in the earliest years so that today's and tomorrow's children have the skills to help the nation prosper. Today, the president's budget took a further bold step by presenting the level of immediate investments in early learning he thinks are needed to support to support our country's young and our own posterity. And I mean, again, I think following on sort of what Hero said, the request today was of historic proportions compared to anything close to what's ever been outlined by any president in their budget before. Just like the degree of lifting up this issue is historic. The budget request seeks new investments that establish a continuum of high quality early learning for children beginning at birth and continuing through age 5. So while the focus today is particularly on the new federal-state partnerships that are being proposed to expand high-quality access for preschool, that includes about $1.3 billion request to Congress for 2014 that would grow significantly over time. There's also a request for $1.4 billion this year for high-quality early learning opportunities in the birth to 3 years. Through new early Head Start childcare partnerships, additional funding for proposed new investments to raise quality and access in the childcare development block grant, and continued investments in home visiting services. Together, the proposed expansion of pre-K early Head Start childcare partnerships, home visiting services would dramatically expand access to high-quality learning for infants and toddlers and preschoolers. So I can answer the first question. We firmly believe these are the right priorities for our nation's early childhood agenda and just for the nation as a whole, that it is historic to make this the major new request in the budget. And so it's an exciting time and promising time to be involved in early childhood policy, though there's a lot of work to do. This is a proposal. There's a lot of work to do from here. To push this issue along, we really need, from this day forward, to engage in a robust and growing national discussion. The input and energy of the experts, like my colleagues on this panel, and those of you in the audience are needed. The changes and advances that we are seeking are not made in Washington, and they're not proposed today. This will take shape as the country debates this, as Congress weighs in on this, as the governors come to address this. They're driven by public demand and by stakeholders' voices. So for anything like this to actually come to fruition will require concerted energies from across all spectrums of the United States. The only other thing I would probably say at the outset and then is, why are we doing this? I think particularly being at a school of education which has been animated for the better part of a few decades around the achievement gap, we know that the achievement gap is wide, that it begins early, and that it does deprive the nation. We have a large achievement gap between children growing up in low-income families and their peers that has been growing over time. It's almost twice the size as it was a couple of generations ago. In childhood disadvantage, and that wouldn't matter so much, except that there are so many children in that situation. Childhood disadvantage is pervasive and it's pernicious, especially when it begins early. It's important to emphasize that achievement gap begins well before kindergarten, and it widens with age. There's evidence that it is visible as early as 9 months in terms of socio-emotional, health, behavioral, and cognitive skills, that it is pronounced by 24 months, and that then it follows trajectories that widen over time, even within the 0 to 5 age spectrum, but then become solidified over time. And we know that high-quality early childhood education provides the foundation for children's success in school and can help reduce the achievement gap. This is putting priority behind that knowledge. So despite the individual and economic benefits of early education, our nation has lagged in its commitment to ensuring the provision of high-quality public preschool in our children's earliest years. The OECD has estimated that the US ranks near the bottom among developed nations in the level of public expenditures to support early care, to support children under the age of 5, even though we rank at the very top of expenditures for K to 12. And that the share of 4-year-olds enrolled in early childhood education also ranks near the bottom among developed countries. And only a relatively small fraction of 4-year-olds are enrolled in programs that are considered high quality, and I think that's going to be an issue we're going to turn to more, but I'm going to start there.
I just want to situate this notion of preschool within the context of the work that the Department of Education has been doing, especially for this administration, because this initiative didn't just appear this morning. This initiative has been growing for the past 4 years. If you look at the strategic plan for the Department of Education, it has 3 major components: early learning, K-12, higher education. So from the very beginning, there was a notion that Secretary Duncan held that we had to figure out how to address this achievement gap, and I think his language is, I'm sick of it, how to address it and make sure that we are providing the very best experiences to young children. We know it's not the children. We know it's the experiences, it's the kinds of opportunities we can provide that can change people's lives. So what we see today is really an outgrowth of trying to figure out over the course of 4 years how we can make a difference in children's lives, how we can use the science that Jack's going to talk about, how we can understand what quality looks like. There is an initiative that I think will be important as we talk about the preschool work, and that is the Early Learning Challenge. This was the first attempt to really look at state systems. For those of you who don't know the American system, if you could start from scratch and design a wonderful system, it wouldn't look like what we have here. It is a patchwork of funding streams, of Head Start and childcare and state-funded work and private providers that we really try to bring together. And so the work of the Early Learning Challenge, those grants were allocated in December of 2012, so we've been talking about this for a while. The work of that challenge was to really support states to bring their systems together. But more than that, it was an attempt to look at quality and define quality across a state. So as we talk about quality, it's interesting because in a way, the federal government in the sort of instantiation of that grant program has already said early learning standards, comprehensive assessment systems, workforce development, family engagement, data systems, health promotion. Those are basic elements that we've said to states you need to be able to have in high quality programs. However, there are other things that we know are necessary. The class size, the teacher preparation, the notion of actually paying preschool teachers at parity with public school teachers. So there's a lot of detail that needs to be figured out in this proposal. I think one of the most exciting moments for me was the night of the State of the Union address, when it wasn't so much that the president said preschool, it was that he said high quality preschool. And even though we haven't defined that, the notion that this is what's important, that these are high quality programs for children is going to be tremendously important. The thing I want to also touch on in my 3 minutes is the notion of universal. Because if you think universal, you think everyone now has free preschool, and that's not quite what this proposal is. It certainly is a huge federal investment, especially targeted to families at 200% of poverty and below, and incentives to states to support preschool for families that make more money, and also incentives, I think, that are going to be there for full-day kindergarten, rather, which is tremendously important that we have high-quality preschool that leads on to not just kindergarten, but actually high-quality first, second, and third grade would be a good thing also. So as we think about whether or not these are the right initiatives, I think they are. I think they are pieces of a continuum that should really fit in our birth to at least third grade and probably birth to grade 12 continuum. But I think this is a huge, huge step forward to signal how important it is that we make sure that we provide high-quality programs to young children. There will be a lot of discussion. As AJ has said, this is an aspirational budget. The president doesn't have the authority to mint money. And so we will now need the country to come forward and support this initiative because it is at a particularly difficult financial time in the country's history. But it is important. It is tremendously important for children with multiple risk factors, and I think that will be something to also think about as we think about what are states going to do with this money? How do they target these resources? How do they make sure that the children who have the most significant risk factors are getting the best quality care and instruction? These are the trade-offs that we've got to start looking at. How do we make sure that all of these elements of quality are there? How do we get the workforce up and ready? There's $750 million for development for states, and I think that will be more than necessary because it is tremendously important for states now to look around and think about what are their resources? What do I have? You know, only 38 states and the District of Columbia support preschool with state money. And so we have those states that have not done anything yet, and they've got to figure out how they get themselves started. So there's a lot of work to be done in thinking about who gets targeted, what does quality look like, and the thing I always say, how do we make sure that we know what we're giving to whom, what works for whom, under what circumstances? How do we make sure that the children who need it most are the children who get the kind of preschool services that lead them to success in school and beyond? Because this is about this achievement gap. Without question, it is about making sure children are able to be successful in school.
Okay. I was worried that I wasn't going to have anything to say after these two went. But I think I do. I have something to say. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Hero, for organizing this. I wanted to start by acknowledging Ed Ziegler, who I think wanted to be here tonight, but actually couldn't in the end. And he's been a champion of this idea of universal pre-K for a long time, which stems from his long history of work in early childhood. And so I wanted to acknowledge his presence here with us, even though he is not actually here with us, but to do something else as well, which is to say, I wrote a book with him on this topic, and I'm not trying to shamelessly do anything here about the book, but I brought it with me, so you can just take a look at it. So in preparing for this, I went back to the book and re-remembered what was in the book, and then I looked at some other more recent books about universal pre-K. And what I learned from doing that was that not a lot has changed until this moment, from the time that we began our book, which is around the year 2000, and right now. So I think that this is genuinely thrilling. I feel like that's what you've heard a little bit of, that this is a big moment. Unusual. I'm shocked about how unusual it is and disappointed by that, but it is a big moment nonetheless. So while if I were to start with this question about where should we prioritize, I think that this is clearly one place that we need to prioritize. We have tons of evidence about this fact. I don't necessarily think that we have met sufficient yet. So, and this is where we get into the details. And the truth is that there really aren't a lot of details about what's going to happen with all of this money and how this is going to happen. But I feel like I could make some comments about some of these details, at least my thoughts on the details. So I think Hero said we're not allowed to talk necessarily about 0 to 3. So I'm not going to do that. But I am going to talk about what happens after you are the age of 4. And this is a comment and it's a fear. And I think, I don't want to be the party pooper here, but maybe I'm going to be that. I have a bunch of fears. So my first fear is this tendency to focus on age or stage and not necessarily on a developmental continuum. So we just heard Jackie refer to this a little bit. There's a great deal of debate right now regarding the long-term effects of UPK, of Head Start, of other high-quality or other types of quality early childhood experiences. And I think we know one thing that is really central to that debate is what happens after that experience. So it's about the quality of the experience, but also what happens after the experience. So spreading access to high-quality pre-K is very important, but it doesn't necessarily help us with the challenge of how to bring together the cultures of pre-K and the culture of elementary school. And I think that this is really important because when we talk about quality, we don't talk about that. That could be an indicator of quality, or it should be an indicator of quality, especially if we are co-locating pre-K in elementary schools, which I think is something that is going to be a feature of this idea. So I don't think that the idea should be to veer toward making pre-K more like first grade. And I jumped to first grade because I think kindergarten has already veered in that direction. I think we really have to think carefully about what the two cultures, people call it, can contribute to each other and really think about a developmental continuum. Okay, first fear. Second set of fears. And this is really related to understanding quality and then thinking about how does someone generate, based on what we know, a real strategy for scaling. So how do we take what you have learned in the BPS about the Universal Pre-K program in BPS and really think about how would that translate to another place? So I'm going to ignore the rest of the scaling issue because I think it's a big, tough nut to crack, and I'll just throw it out there. But I will talk a little bit about quality. And when I think about quality, I think about the usual structural features that were mentioned, things like ratios and class size. I also think about three other elements. The first element is the skilled use of an explicit evidence-based curricula. And that doesn't mean a curricula or a curriculum for everything, which I think is where we're sitting right now. Oh, you need a social emotional learning curriculum, you need a math curriculum, you need a literacy curriculum, and then, and then you need a bunch of other stuff. And so you need to spend, you are mandated to spend 15 minutes on each one of these things. So when I talk about explicit evidence-based curricula, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something that locates itself in high-quality practices, high-quality instructional practices that build skills in multiple domains. And this is maybe where some of this money goes to development, but I think we have some clues about what this looks like already in the world. But because we don't invest in really understanding it deeply, we jump to, oh, I'm going to use this, and I'll combine it with this, and then I have to add this. And so we have a whole variety of things. And that gets really tough in an early childhood classroom. The second element of quality is adults who are well-trained in child development and who are supported in an ongoing manner, not just in delivering curricula, but in how to see and capitalize on teaching opportunities and how to manage their own stress, burnout, and regulatory challenges as adults. So there's something really necessary to quality that has to do with professionalizing and supporting the early childhood workforce in a way that I think we do with K to 12, although some might disagree with me. The third facet of quality has to do with compositional issues. And this is really about who you're with makes a difference for how you do over time. And there is some evidence that as a low-income child, having an experience in a mixed-income classroom serves you well over time. But we don't really understand the mechanisms of those compositional effects. And I think they actually could be quite important. And with some of what's in this plan, in terms of who's being served and who's being incentivized to be served, this is an important issue. So my fear without this kind of very clear model of quality and this scalable strategy, we are possibly engaging in a process of spreading what is mediocre. And we are setting ourselves up, potentially, this is the devil in the details, for continuing to lament and debate about whether or not investments in early childhood make a difference. Okay, final fear, and then I'll let Jack bring us all back up. Okay, my final comment has to do with measurement and assessment. So part of the plan is to get really serious about accountability, measurement, assessment. And one thing this is a small thing, but I think it's actually quite a big thing. I'm not really sure we have available to us or are using the best measures of quality. So some of you know there are studies, many studies actually coming out that attempt to link measures of quality to child outcomes, but don't. So there's something about what we are thinking is quality and how we're representing it in our assessment systems that is actually not what we think it is. And it's not tied to child outcomes. So, but this is really great. I'm very happy about it. It's true. So invite me into the details, and then I'll just tell you what to do.
So hopefully I won't have to blow my nose again with my bad cold. This is great to be here. So thank you. Also, obviously, with my buddies on the panel. So I just want to echo some things and then put an uplifting challenge on the table. So this is an amazing group to kind of sit with up on the stage. And I totally endorse words like historic and kind of field-changing. This really is a huge step forward, and the administration should be commended incredibly highly for putting this stake in the ground. I was thinking and looking at the 5 of us up here and the people out there and realized that actually where this goes is going to be dependent much more on the people sitting in the audience and the people up on the stage. So let me just kind of say a little bit about this. And I think to take this historic stake in the ground and think about where it's going to go, this is a litmus test for the early childhood field. And I'm going to build on a number of points that people made. First off, for anybody who knows anything about policy, so what's been presented here and what was announced in the budget this morning is a proposal, a very bold proposal for a new policy direction. Now, we have a very well-functioning kind of federal system right now that will move this very quickly with a lot of broad-based support. And all the money will be there at the end. And even if that were true, and even if this budget were passed exactly as it is being proposed, so that would then raise the question of, okay, now this is a policy that has some official kind of improvements on it, so it has to be implemented. And the implementation is the ultimate devil in the details. And now we kind of ask ourselves, so what's the challenge to the field? And what's the challenge to everybody out here? So everyone's talked about quality here. Stephanie kind of put a little bit more of an exclamation point on the problems with quality. And I'm going to put a different exclamation point on that. We know that we have tremendous challenges with highly variable quality. And it's absolutely right that if quality isn't a major focus in implementing whatever funds ultimately come out, and if it doesn't get through this current political environment, you know, it's an idea that's on its way, and it's going to come, it's coming fast. But God help us if we don't do something about the quality of the way this money gets spent. Mostly because the goal here is for children to do better. And we know that children don't do better when they get poor quality early childhood services, especially the most disadvantaged children, who we have to think about not just at age 4, but we're not allowed to talk about birth to 3. Okay.
That plan is now
Yeah, okay. But the other thing I want to say about this is so if we have to set the bar and say there will be tremendous pressure to serve more children. And that'll be a conflict between those who want to serve more children and those who want to improve quality. And if we stand our ground strongly on quality, we're going to set the bar higher than the ground, but I would still say not high enough, because there'll still be variable quality, and a lot of money will be spent and will not get the kind of impact that we're talking about in terms of better educational outcomes and a more productive adult population and all the things that go with it. So if we ratchet the bar up even higher, and this is not as high as I want it to go, but if we ratchet higher and we'll say that we will not rest until every single dollar that's spent in every single preschool program for every 4-year-old matches best practices, matches the state of the art of what we've done. And that's a goal that's going to take a long time to get to. As a goal, it's completely kind of economically and morally untenable to aim for anything less. How could we aim for anything less? This is a field that's decades and decades old with knowledge. So I would suggest, and what I want to put as my predictable piece on the table here, is to say that the goal of all of the funds at the federal and the state level going to the highest quality early childhood education as we know how to provide, from my perspective, is a baseline. It's not the promised land. Because the baseline of the best of what we've ever achieved is unquestionably improving trajectories, unquestionably producing better outcomes. But the magnitude of those impacts is not enough to close that achievement gap that everybody's talking about. And we have been living in an environment where we talk about closing the achievement gap by providing high quality services. And the answer to that issue is that we need new ideas, that we need to kind of get to state of the art as fast as possible and build into this new historic shift of a stake in the ground for early childhood and say, we need new ideas. And for those of us, this will be my one little kind of advertisement for neuroscience. We've been using neuroscience very effectively for the collective we, for the last decade in building greater public will for people to understand how the early years really matter. And this is something that represents a good investment, which has been played some part, among a lot of other things, in why we're at a point now where there's a broad-based public understanding of the importance of investing in early childhood. We have to start using the science in a different way, not just to build political will, to put resources into the things we know how to do, but to use science to drive the fresh thinking, the new ideas that will take us to a higher level of impact with a whole new generation of interventions that have yet to be tested and put on the ground. And if we get to some examples, discussion, we can do that. That's the promised land. Otherwise, we'll have a fully funded, high-quality early care and education system that'll shift the curve, and all the kids who've been disadvantaged will be doing better, but we're still going to have a lot of kids who aren't getting far enough in education, are not economically productive in a global economy, and going to jail, and that's just unacceptable.
Well, I think this was an extraordinarily exciting way to kind of take this kind of skeleton that really is in the proposal and start raising some of the real issues that will confront us in the implementation, and that's really everybody in this room, as Jack mentioned. But I think starting with where Jack finished, I think, and in some ways each of you has said something along these lines, that this is actually an opportunity to redefine what quality means in early childhood education. And one thing that, you know, perhaps can strike us is that our classic notions of quality actually are about things that we can see in a classroom. That's extremely important. It's the core. We certainly here at the School of Education, we talk about the instructional core in K-12 education, and of course preschool is no different. But I think Stephanie raised the notion of thinking about quality as something that stretches before and after the 4-year-old quote-unquote preschool year. Jacqueline has been extraordinarily successful. You know, her huge achievement was to bring this idea of thinking of quality at the systems level up to the level of state policy systems. So I would love to hear, you know, what do we think of as quality at the systems level? And so I think we have some sense that quality needs to be challenged as a concept. It needs to be thought of as something that more than the teacher is connected with. Professional development systems, the next level of system up from the school building is extraordinarily important. So I would love for us in at least these next few minutes to expand a little bit, and can we imagine what are some of the key dimensions of quality that should be perhaps part of the conversation as implementation, no matter what the ultimate amount of money is. If we really care about quality, how do we expand this beyond even the notions that were listed in the President's proposal? So anyone who wants to respond to this?
I'll start with a couple of things. People have mentioned that there's still a lot of details to be worked out, and I think that's sort of appropriate. That what this initiative that provided more information today has done is really put the stake in the ground, sort of saying this is where we as a country need to head. And it also sort of today, for the first time, outlined the level of investment, and the level of investment is geared towards at least high-quality inputs and an expectation of high-quality services. I don't think anyone in the administration wants to see us scale up early childhood preschool as it exists now, but sort of how do we make sure that investments occur in the future that are structured in a way that they would support raising quality. And that's, one, the level of investment, the expectation that teachers would have training in early childhood education and be compensated at the same level as a K-12 educator. I took the point that we sort of make sure that we align what we do in preschool to what we do at least in the early transition years from K to 3. And that again means working in both directions. That does not mean necessarily saying, well, let's take what we do in K to 3 and age it down 1 year and sort of say, let's start that earlier. It's working from the bottom up as well. So we're saying, if this is what we do, if this is how we understand kids learn at 2, 3, 4, what does that imply for how do we make sure that the system's aligned from K to 3? So there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of discussion to be had about what would be occurring in quality. But I think the level of investment is of the scale, and it's very pronounced, that would support high-quality education for kids. And I think one of the things that we have now is that quality is very variable in the programs that are called that exist in state pre-K programs. And what we're saying is you've got to invest at the higher end of that to make sure that we get there.
I think that for a long time, the field of early childhood has seen quality as an end goal. We have to have quality, and that was it. Without this notion of quality as a means for children doing better and significantly better. And I think Jack's quite right here. We can't just have these little impacts that we have. We have to get kids moving a lot faster, a lot better, a lot stronger. But I think we've been faced with an early childhood system that's been so underfunded, and states developing so many different kinds of markers for quality. So the notion of having a BA versus having a high school diploma, the notion of half day, full day, there are programs that are 2.5 hours. Really? So I think what we have to think about is, what do we know from the science that works, really works, and how do we make sure that we can scale that up? And how do we make sure that at the state level, because these are state grants. These aren't grants going, it's not the Head Start model where the grants go from the federal government to communities. These are going to states. And so at a state level, there has to be a sense, a vision of what the expectations are. And I think the notion of how we look at how children are progressing over time is going to be important. One of the things we hardly ever talk about is evaluation. How do we make sure that as we send this money out, we're doing longitudinal studies. We're looking at how these children are doing across cohorts of kids going forward. And that we're putting money into the early elementary as well as the rest of the K-12 system, because it really doesn't help if you have a fabulously high quality program for preschool and the child goes off to kindergarten, first, second, third grade, and that's really problematic. I think the notion of aligning this continuum is much more difficult than we imagine. We talk about aligning preschool standards to K-12. We did that in New Jersey, and it was a fascinating experience of having K-12 people, early childhood people, just sort of looking at each other. Like, what? Okay, what can this be? What is this social emotional thing? Well, this social emotional thing probably is something that lasts our whole lives if we are going to be sane. So, I think it's, what are we talking about? What kind of kids do we want to produce? What's our end goal? And I think to look at that in a really important way means pumping money into the system, yes, in ways that give us some sense of a good curriculum. But the early learning standards that we put out there seem to me to need to be the guides. We have every state now that has standards for 3- and 4-year-olds. We need to look really carefully at those standards and say, are those things appropriate? Are they rigorous? Are they adequate? Do they really reflect child development? And then we have curriculum that really is designed to make sure that kids get to where they need to go. And then we have teacher preparation that really ensures us that the teachers in those classrooms can move children along there. And that's a huge piece of this work that I think will take us a long time. There is tremendous variation across the country in quality because there's tremendous variation in teacher preparation and teacher expertise. And that's something we have to acknowledge as a field. And I think we need much better teacher preparation programs. And that's always a challenge, but we do, because otherwise we'll be just producing teachers who may go to programs in good faith, but really don't get the kinds of experience and induction that they need to do this work. So there's a lot to do to get this thing that's now seems kind of amorphous called quality. But I think it is a notion of how kids do and how do we make sure that over time we have the data that we need to be able to say children did better than they would have done without this intervention.
So I'm not going to comment. I think you're exactly right. I'm just going to ask maybe a different kind of question. Two questions. One is I don't know what I'm going to say. Are there dollars set aside for embedded longitudinal studies that could have some kind of?
I saw something that said evaluation today.
So there's stuff in there
Yeah,
for
there's
real.
money for evaluation. What that evaluation would be is still to be defined.
Right. So then I guess the second question, and is related to your comment, Jackie, which is how is it possible? So there's a lot of work to be done. I think you described a comprehensive but sort of giant agenda to get this to happen. And is there a process for slowing down a little bit? Because I hear, Jax, this idea. I'm I'm sorry. There's no need to worry about slowing down. But there's
It's called legislative process.
Yeah. but the challenge is the rush to serve more children, which is a real thing, and to do it in this way that builds on, growing and accumulated knowledge and doing things that we haven't seemed to be able to do before.
So I want to weigh in on this quality issue and talk about the kind of climate and the mindset of early childhood and how the quality issue won't be dealt with adequately until we change the way we think about the word quality. So right now, the word quality triggers, it's a euphemism for what you're doing isn't good enough, right? I mean, that's kind of when we talk about quality, we're talking about programs that are poor quality. And in the business world, which I don't really know anything about firsthand, but I'm learning more about it, the companies, the corporations that are at the top of their game are always focusing on improving the quality of what they do and always thinking about how to get to where things are going to go next before their competitors, because they know that they won't stay on top if they're not at that edge. And nobody thinks about, in that sense, quality improvement and focusing on quality is seen as the way to kind of be good and stay good. And in education, in particular early childhood, quality means we really know there are a lot of programs that aren't that good. So we have to change the way we talk about quality. And I think the key, in my mind, is to start with the kind of things that Stephanie is doing, which is kind of, so we haven't talked at all about parents, right? So we talked about this need for building the capacities and the skills of the people who work in programs. And there's this parallel issue about building the capacities and skills in parents who, and last time I checked, the knowledge base said that even with all of the program variables, family variables explain a bigger percentage of the variance and outcome than any kind of curriculum issue. So what's the common denominator here? The common denominator is, and the way we start to think about this, is if we want to focus on really changing life prospects for kids, we have to transform the lives of the adults who are taking care of them. And that includes their parents and the people who are working in programs. And it means not just urging them to do a better job and giving them some information and advice, and all of that in the kind of veiled context of what they're doing isn't good enough. And build skills, build capacities. So what's so wonderful about the work that Stephanie is doing that I kind of know more about is it's building capabilities of people working in programs to be able to not only administer a curriculum, but to be able to manage very poorly regulated environments where there's a lot of behavioral difficulty to take care of. And it could easily be crystallized as a kind of a strength-based enhancing thing to be a part of. Remember, because a lot of this comes from coaching and mentoring and supervision and practice. And there's nothing stigmatizing about coaching. Elite athletes depend on coaches and depend on practicing what the coaches tell them, as do corporate CEOs. And so we give information and advice instead of coaching. So I think a lot of what needs to happen is to stop having quality variation be a bad word, have improving quality be a strength-enhancing, affirming concept in the field, and then gets to, my pet issue about if you get used to the fact that you can always be better, when everybody's doing state-of-the-art, people are not going to feel like, okay, we're there. They're going to be imbued with this idea of always wanting to get better, push things to a higher level. And that's what has to happen. It has to be an affirming sense of the fact that we need to raise the bar and accomplish more, and not reassure ourselves when we get a statistically significant difference on 3 of the 25 things we measured and declare victory.
All right, with that challenge, we're going to open it up for the Q&A. So if you could come to one of the microphones, and if you have a question, please introduce yourself first, and then I'm sure we'll have a even richer and more wide-ranging conversation. Yes, go ahead.
I'm Eve Sullivan. Thank you very much. I am a graduate of the school approaching my 50th reunion. How did that happen? I did a little bingo game for myself to make sure that my favorite topic, parenting education, was mentioned. I serve on the board of the National Parenting Education Network. And I heard the moderator say it at the beginning, and then I started to think I was going to be crying till the very end. Thank you, Dr. Shankar. I wonder if a lot of the way we speak about children in early childhood programs, I'm a grandmother of 3, it's the best thing. We imagine that they're orphans. They're not. They have parents, and these parents have as many needs and confusion and learning trajectories as their youngsters do. So I just hope that the evaluation piece and the high quality piece and the well-trained, the serve and return communication will percolate also to the parenting education component, which I'm sure is part of all of your work. Thank you.
Sure, and actually we just completed a study, a review of all of the rigorous evaluations of early childhood education since 1960. It's this large database developed out of the Center on the Developing Child, and Todd Grindle is in the audience. He's the first author on this study. What we found was, our question was, what's the added benefit of parenting education in the context of early childhood education? But what we did was to actually divide the parenting education components into 2 types. The first was kind of classes, group sessions, providing information about parenting and child development to parents. The second was a set that provided parents the opportunity to practice skills and model, and in the context of a coaching or mentoring or home visiting relationship. Well, it turns out the classes, the parenting education classes, the didactic, those things had absolutely no added benefit for kids' cognitive skills above and beyond the preschool education itself. It was only when parents had the opportunities for the skill, the practicing the skills and the modeling, that increased the average effect of preschool education. In fact, it doubled the average effect of preschool education on cognitive outcomes. So the lesson is we cannot expect classes and simply providing information to make any difference to children's outcomes above and beyond preschool education. We have to provide components that provide opportunities for active skill development. And I think Stephanie's work is also treating teachers and parents in the same way, looking at organizational. Everyone's talking about Stephanie's work, so you should probably talk about it.
No, I don't need to.
I'm going to alternate here, so yeah.
Great. I'm Kathy Keene, and I work up at White Mountains Community College in Berlin. We've had the pleasure of having Hero speak with us in the past, which is delightful. Stephanie, I want you to write another book, please. I need to know about those evidence-based practices. So, but curiosity for me is, do you think that any of this funding could be directed towards loan forgiveness for people who are passionate about early childhood, who want to go to school to learn how to teach our best and brightest, but maybe like the early 70s when we encouraged people to get into special ed, or President Obama now wants to encourage people to get into STEM. I can't encourage my children to go to school and spend $100,000 or more to come out and make $7 or $8 or $9 an hour. So loan forgiveness programs, continue to teach for 10 years and you won't have to pay your loans back, seems to be a solution to me.
So there is a model, New Jersey, for example, paid for teachers to go back to school. So there was no forgiveness because that was part of the deal. That was payment. And the goal, remember, is not that they come back and make $8 an hour, but they're paid at parity with public school teachers.
Right. And North Carolina has such a model, too. Yep.
Yep.
Great idea. I love it, though.
Hi, my name is Matthew Singh. I'm a degree candidate in city planning at the design school, and I'm doing work around the business side of early care and education for my thesis. And so what I wanted to ask about, especially as it relates to quality, we know that this is overwhelmingly a public-private system, so what is being addressed in terms of the business side when we look at issues of economies of scale, profit margins, the ability to carry debt, either to expand programs or even have decent quality facilities? How is that being addressed in the current proposal?
There's nothing that I know of in the proposal. Obviously, the largest centerpiece part of this, which is the Preschool for All initiative, doesn't preclude these to be community-based preschool programs, but we would expect that many of them would build on the current school architecture.
But I think they will be mixed delivery models.
Right, there'll be mixed delivery, so yes.
And if you look at those models around the country of mixed delivery, they've really had to think about the business end of it, but I don't see any of that yet in this
Right.
proposal. It'll probably be
Yeah.
in
And then again, the major partner in all of this is the states. So a lot will depend. Some states do all of their pre-K through this school system. Many other states do a mixed delivery system. Some of them partner with Head Start or child care programs or private programs. So I think a lot will depend on what the states propose to do.
I'll just add one more point on this. You know, there's a large part of the early childhood community that's always trying to think about how to get the business community to kind of help support this. And usually that's translated in terms of how do we get business leaders to tell their legislators to vote for money for pre-K. I think one of the things that really is kind of sitting here waiting to be exploited is that thing that people in the business community understand, that it's less about what things cost and more about what the value is and the return on investment. And we've been stuck in this issue about what does it cost, which often kind of gets you in the realm of getting away with as cheap an approach to this as possible, which leads you down that, you know, terrible path of poor quality. So this is where kind of tapping into the way business people think can be very helpful, and not worry so much about whether something that costs more actually is less expensive than something that costs less and does nothing, as opposed to something that costs more and gives you a big return. So that's another way to think about the kind of business dimension of this. It's been a very narrow, impoverished way of thinking about costs and returns, because it's been mostly about cost.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Theodore Kokoros. I'm an alumni of Jack's course, and I currently teach preschool in Boston. So currently about 5% of all preschool teachers are male, and we've seen that part of the achievement gap is that many boys are struggling. Do you believe as a part of a push for higher quality, we should try to have incentives and push for more males to get into the field?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
How do we do that?
And I have no idea. Well, but it's about incentivizing the position, right? I mean, I think we've talked about it in different ways. It's about making it an attractive thing to do, that you are paid well for, that you are trained and coached and supported to do, that you are valued as a central lever in developing the future workforce. So I think there's more to it than loan forgiveness, although I love that idea. And I think it has to do with like really getting serious about early childhood as something that is valuable, that we all actually, for people outside the room, in addition to in the room, we really view it as something that's serious and important and valued.
Sounds like a good strategy for attracting capable and competent women to go into the field as well.
It's the same, yes.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Raji, and I'm instructor of neurology at the medical school. And my question, I also have fears, and a couple of them is, some thoughts were, I heard this thought in my head, one size fit all, and then another thought I had was short-term approach or short-term measurements. Infants, toddlers, or anyone for that matter, we're all distinctly, we have unique ways of interacting, socializing, and learning. When I'm around toddlers, I see them learning in very different ways. And also another thing was a lot of commentary on productivity, how we can all be very productive citizens, and all that is good. But are we also self-actualized and socialized individuals? And putting one sort of a glove on every child, I feel the best thing about being around a toddler rather than an adult, forgive me, is they're so creative, and they challenge you every moment. And for me to see that we're going to dumbify them, which happens to us when we grow up, we sort of have to. That's the way to adapt to the world. Is we lose so much of that, and I fear that. How are we going to measure what a 4-year-old learned? That may show up when they're 30 and not when they're 5. So for me, there's a lot of fear surrounding this. And we all know the best teachers at every level have a level of imagination, intuition, and experience that they combine with the way they approach. It almost feels like the teacher's talking to me. No, she's talking to 40 people. How are we going to fit all that into this? That's my question. Any thoughts?
Mm-hmm.
So those are great questions. I think that I'll start with the one-size-fits-all issue. I think that is a real challenge, and it's going to be a central challenge to this process of spending this money. And it's not the case that they're the one-size-fits-all. This speaks to the targeted versus universal, targeted and universal, however you want to phrase it. It's also about how do we take what we've learned from Boston, let's say, or from Georgia, or Oklahoma, or these other places that seem to be doing something that's making a difference, and distill out of it the central component, the instructional practices that are really operative. And it might be about imagination and creativity. It could be about layering into content a different kind of practice that is elevated from content. But we don't know yet what that is. So part of the magic is going to be about figuring out what you can't lose, and then what you can elaborate on or differentiate on or have be different based on where things are happening. So I assume that in the process of getting into the details, this is going to be part of the conversation, of course.
I think this is an important concern, because we're so quick sometimes to have a measurement notion of things. If there is a particular score at a particular time in that child's life, everything's fine. So one of the things that I would hope we would do is sort of broaden our notions of what kind of folks we want to produce. Mm-hmm. And if we have to talk about this achievement gap, and we do, how do we make sure that we still have children who are creative and curious and wonderful and full of wonder, but still can read? I mean, there are basic things that I think we see as a country are missing from children's lives, and that keeps them back in ways that we can't tolerate anymore. So we've got to make sure that all of that comes together, but that we don't lose that more affective notion of children's interactions is critical. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Fran Hurley, and I'm a graduate of the Ed School. I would like for you to talk a little bit about the magic. So in your travels, what have you seen that's been just wonderful and worth emulating?
So I have a magic. When I was at the department, we decided one day we would all shadow educators. And so senior staff went out and spent the day shadowing folks out there really teaching. And I had the absolute honor of spending the day in a Montessori school in Maryland with 22 children, a teacher and an assistant. The children were ages 3, 4, and 5. And it was magic. This teacher was glorious because she had a sense of every child. They were with her for 3 years, so they knew her very well. They had these great materials, and they were interacting with these materials in their own way, and she understood the ways in which that should happen. So to see someone navigating that, and I often tell the story, if those children were the exact same chronological age, but the same variations in development, we would say, oh, how can that happen? This is just so terrible. No one can do that. Yes, you can. And clearly, this kind of passion for teaching and excellent training and experience, it was quite a day. I was very tired, but it was good.
I think of magic in part as going back to this issue of scale that a few people mentioned, that it is certainly something we can observe in a single classroom. And there are instances of great classrooms in any system across the country, but then how do we spread that? So I know the Boston system has been mentioned a couple of times, and Jason Sachs, who's the Director of Early Childhood Services, is here from Boston, and I was just wondering whether he could, this is like a call out, but I actually think this is, this is a case of a system that has actually demonstrated this scale issue of having solved it at the city level. So I don't know if you could just, in a really brief nutshell, say what the keys were here in Boston.
He's got the magic formula.
Yeah, that's it, magic.
I mean, I think the issue of having a strong curriculum is critical. I think that the OWL and building blocks were developmentally appropriate, really well thought out, intentional curriculum. And then we told teachers that it was a tool, not a rule, and that they could then bounce off of the curriculum if they knew what they were doing. And knowing what they're doing is a trick, right? And so for us, it was the relationship between coaches who came from both community-based programs and public schools, and really kind of developing that partnership so that they could really focus on quality and inspire the stronger teachers, and the teachers who weren't so strong really thinking about what kind of professional development they need and really developing systems underneath it, and then really owning the classrooms, working with principals, going to those classrooms. And so actually that's sort of a question that I would ask all of us is, what is the role of public schools and community-based programs? Do we really want to think of them as separate anymore? Should we think of them as feeder, owning one another, being responsible both for curriculum and the children and the transitions? So I just would push us to think differently around that partnership.
Yeah, because I had this immediate response to your notion of these things being separate. You know, I think we have in this proposal a notion of reaching lots of children. And in many cases, these are going to be more children than the public schools can handle. And so it is tremendously important to have Head Start programs, community providers, everyone, and school-based programs all on the same page. It can be done. We've seen these models where it's not a matter of the school is really separate and the community providers are different. Again, if we have all of these folks under the same set of standards, they're all being trained well, everyone's being paid at the same kind of level, then I think we have a great opportunity with a huge amount of work. And I just want to say that none of this happens overnight. You can get a good curriculum, you can have all those things in place, but you really need coaches and folks really on the ground helping and supporting teachers. It takes a while. So it's not going to be that money comes from the federal government and suddenly there's high quality the next year. It's going to take a while to really build these programs.
So let me add one other piece to this issue of the magic, and use this as an opportunity to put the birth to 3 or birth to 4 issue back on the table. I mean, for understandable reasons, given what we're talking about. Most of this discussion has been focusing on what happens in a learning environment, in a classroom, And no question, I mean, that kind of magic that Jacqueline described it's not just an occasional, there's a lot of that out there. But there's another kind of magic that has tremendous implications for the education system that is not in this discussion, which is the magic that happens very early in life in situations where you have children living in the most extremely difficult circumstances and parents and other caregivers who, because of their own traumas, are kind of deeply impaired in their ability to provide that foundation that's going to make it a lot easier for these preschool programs. And when you see the programs that produce what looks like magic, that same downward extension, and this is the classic example of you get punished for preventing things. So these are the kids who could have been the most disruptive and the most difficult when they got to school, who were just like every other kid in this school, because some magic happened early on. And I'm not going to put the burden of this on this magnificent achievement that the administration just made by putting the stake in the ground. But as a society, there's other magic in other places that is critically important to the success of everything we're doing here. And you know, we all know that cliche about you could have that magical classroom you saw if there were 3 children in that classroom or 2 whose behavior was so dysregulated that the teacher could really not avoid paying attention, that whole environment would be changed for everybody else. So we shouldn't lose sight of what's not in this proposal and shouldn't.
Well, it is. It just wasn't discussed today. Yeah, these other elements are a part of this.
But also to show how much pressure there is on an administration that's putting a big stake in the ground, where there are always other things you could say, why haven't you done this and why haven't you done that? And we shouldn't do that because it's not fair, but we shouldn't forget how important those other pieces are.
So one very practical response to your question about partnerships, there is a group of districts in the state of Washington who have begun a collaboration. You may know about them. There is a brief about what they're doing, and they've begun a partnership, but they are doing something at the level of the adults, not just the adults in classrooms, but the adults who run these different systems. And the process is sitting down together and talking about, I think you did this in New Jersey, talking about this is the goal, this is my goal in this particular setting, and this is my goal in this particular setting. How are they different and the same? But it is having the time and the inclination to do that sitting down together in a way that is repeated and consistent,
Leadership that
generative.
really fosters that, I think, is important.
I think this side, yeah.
Good evening, and thank you so much for an excellent presentation. My name is Amy Grace. I'm a Master of Public Health candidate at the Harvard School of Public Health. I'm also a pediatrician by background. There's some of us here who are part of a working group on the American Academy of Pediatrics looking at how to address childhood poverty, and the incoming president is very interested in this initiative and also supporting early childhood education. And Dr. Shankar, you had mentioned that a lot of the success of the implementation of this proposal depends on all of us in the audience. And so I'm wondering, in terms of how can the American Academy of Pediatrics, or all of us, or other community groups interested in child health and child poverty, what can we do to ensure the successful implementation of this policy?
Let's have lunch sometime.
Yeah.
Have a conversation about it.
Me too.
I mean, you know, I think the quick answer to this, which is the real challenge, and I know a lot of people in the academy are trying to do this, is to figure out what the medical community generally, and pediatricians in particular, can do other than what goes on in their offices. Because the problem, these needs are not going to be solved in what can be done in a 7-minute visit in an office, and particularly with the kind of training that pediatricians have. So I think this is where the need to rethink, there's a lot of emphasis on the medical home right now, is to kind of be thinking in terms of how the pediatric piece fits into a larger kind of community-based context, rather than how the medical home can be transformed to kind of be the savior here, because I don't think that's going to happen. Huge opportunities.
Yes, absolutely.
And so while today we've been focused on the pre-K piece, which is the biggest piece, what I will say is when we've talked about the birth to 3 piece in particular, and Secretary Sebelius at HHS has been very key on this, we've sort of said we have to move early health and early learning in parallel and in a 2-generational way. So what that has meant is that we have to get to the point where we provide services so that we meet children at birth. And we meet them with early learning and early health services that gives them a trajectory into pre-K, but that's a course, and also make sure that the child has a medical home and that you're addressing parenting needs simultaneously. And we've talked about sort of models, particularly in this new Early Head Start Child Care Partnership, to make sure we're addressing the learning and the health and care needs of children sort of simultaneously. So, and one of the nice things there is room in this model for demonstration and innovation, and we're trying to make sure that we have the opportunity, as Jack would say, not just to get the outcomes that we've gotten, but how do we sort of raise the bar to sort of say, if you address this in a pediatric site, or if you address this in a home visiting site, what are the differences in those outcomes, and can we test those?
And I think this is where the measurement issue is so critical, because we're going to have to measure different things from what we've been measuring, and we're going to have to figure out how to measure them well, or else we'll have no way of knowing whether we're making a difference, and we'll just rely we'll rely on things like, well, people like this, there's high satisfaction, people feel good about it, but that's not going to get at the kind of things we're talking about. It's a huge challenge, great time to be entering the field.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Han Ho. I'm a child psychiatry physician. So my question is about the interface between healthcare and the school education. And in particular, I just wanted to ask whether there's any areas that we are still not doing well enough. Like we have programs like Head Start, many different programs, but whether there's still areas that we are not doing well enough in terms of disease prevention, health education, all the sort in a school setting, and what should we do?
Oh, I'd love to take that one. So I'll give you just a little sense of a theory of change that we're working on right now to address the kind of early roots of disparities in learning and behavior and physical and mental health, because there is this issue of a social class gradient, and that there are certain basic risk factors we've known about for more than 100 years that predict that you're more at risk to not only have trouble in school, but have health problems later and not live as long, and all of the other things. And so part of a theory of change that we're working on right now that draws on advances in biology is to say that our basic kind of model has always been a variation on an enrichment model, kind of provide enriched learning opportunities, provide information, kind of provide support. And the other side of this is getting at the kind of the biology of adversity, and all of this kind of exploding knowledge about the impacts of significance, what we call toxic stress, on physiological systems that affect brain development and other organ system development, where the answer wouldn't be advice and information. The question is, how could we provide some buffering protection against this kind of damaging effect of physiological disruption from deep poverty and violence and everything else? So the punchline, one good example for the medical profession is back to the American Academy of Pediatrics a couple of years ago. There was pressure to ask what could pediatricians do to identify earlier children who are at risk for heart disease. And what came out was we need to up the ante on focusing on getting kids to eat well early in life and exercise. And the third thing was maybe we should be screening cholesterol levels in children, down even to age 8, and maybe we should start statin medication for kids who have elevated cholesterols. What happened to screening for children experiencing excessive stress that's accelerating atherosclerosis, and think about that as a way to think about health promotion and disease prevention, not just a pill? That would be an example I would give.
So I would just add to that, the complement to this kind of screening would have to be something that you do to support kids who are experiencing that kind of stress. And I think that what often happens in early childhood programs is the do is about letters and numbers. The do is not about self-regulation or executive function or this broad class of social and emotional skills. So I think that's part of the complement to the screening.
If science drove policy now, this would be as much in the health budget as it would be in the education budget. That's the point. It's not like two different things to kind of protect healthy development, which includes the brain last time I checked.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I just wanted to thank our fabulous panelists for joining us tonight, and I'm sure the group can stay up here for a few minutes, but we have to close. So.